Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 23 of The Pick List. How's your week been?
Hello Laura, it's been really good, thank you. I've had a busy week writing and actually a busy week having some writing being published as well. I've just had a big feature on the plant-based category come out in the grocer, and also a piece in the Telegraph on the future of supermarket counters. So lots of writing for me at the moment. How's your week been?
I'm very excited about your Telegraph piece in particular. It's brilliant. Good week, thank you. Doing quite a lot of planning. We've got a big Meet Businesswomen sessions running on the 23rd and 24th of November on women in meat tech. So we've got technology and transformation experts talking to us about robotics and automation in the meat space. That's going to be really exciting to see what's coming next and what's after blockchain.
That sounds really exciting. I'll be very interested to hear your report back on how those sessions go.
I'll keep you posted. So we've got another amazing episode this week.
We do indeed. We're joined this week by Bruce Drinkwater, who is chairman and founder of StormBrands, a branding consultancy that does lots and lots of work in FMCG. Bruce has got lots of experience of the grocery industry and all things FMCG, so he can bring a really interesting perspective to the articles.
Should we start the show?
Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're delighted to have you. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you do and how you're related to food and grocery?
My name's Bruce Drinkwater. I'm the chairman of StormBrands, which I established back in 1994. So we're a branding consultancy. We've designed for most of the UK retailers, and we've also done an awful lot of FMCG food brands and strategic positioning. So over the years, I've worked on a lot of different food brands. So that's myself.
And we're really excited to get a sort of sense of that broad perspective that you have across the market. You've brought some very interesting articles, very topical pieces for us to discuss as well. Why don't you tell us about the first article you've picked for us?
Yeah, the first article I've taken is from Reuters. And the title base is Aldi UK to ramp up click and collect trial. The article basically explains they've obviously increased the trial to 200 stores out. They've got 900 at the moment, and they have obviously an 8% market share. But obviously they've been very clever in terms of the way they position themselves. In April, they sold a lot of food parcels, which they used Deliveroo and partnered with to help the vulnerable, which I thought was excellent. And the CEO, Giles Hurley, has actually said that it's been a hugely powerful so far, been very successful. And I think they see, obviously, shopping the channel. It's 14% now, which is a huge growth over the last recent months, and actually predicted over the next few years to increase to up to 30%. So it's an amazing opportunity. And also, I think the challenge for the conventional retailers and supermarkets is obviously they always had a bit of a differentiator in their home delivery and their click and collect. So the challenge for them now that Aldi start to eat into their arena and starting to take advantage of the opportunities of home delivery, I think it's going to be really interesting. And also what I thought was fascinating and I really liked about it was you actually can, once you order, they will actually deliver it to your car, which I think in this current COVID situation is a really great thing. The fact that you can actually sit in your car and their staff will actually bring the food out to you. So I think that's a really positive message, and one I think other retailers need to be aware of, because I'm sure they're not going to stop at 200 stores. I'm sure it's going to increase. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing them actually delivering as well as having the click and collect facility.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting in what they've done is how they've leveraged a partner like Deliveroo, because the sort of the setup costs around online operations, of course, are huge. So making the economies of scale work can be quite challenging if it's not a major part of your business. I mean, it remains challenging for all of the major grocers as well. Whereas if you have a partner like that, you can offer an element of online without needing to invest in your own delivery fleet, for instance.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. And it'll be interesting to see if the offer starts to expand from what they have in store. Because again, another slight disadvantage they have over some of the bigger superstores is obviously they have got less product. But obviously, as soon as they start getting to the facility and be able to offer a delivery service and a click and collect, there's an opportunity to actually offer a wider profile and a wider product portfolio. So that could be interesting as well. Fascinating. And I'm sure Lidl will be watching them with care as well.
You're totally right, and it's a fascinating article. And as you say, Julia, for Aldi to move into their own distribution and have their own wheels is a massive step. But you can imagine their efficiency on this click and collect rollout trial, and even something simple that they embedded quite early doors, wasn't it? Was their stop-start lighting at the store entrance to show when shoppers have capacity to go in. Interestingly, something just Tesco are just starting to roll out now, and Aldi have had it in play for a couple of months. And you can soon imagine Aldi having dedicated bays, I suppose a bit like Halfords have in their stores, where you can pull up and get service, and as you say, Bruce, delivered to your car there, that they could be real leaders in this. And there's a huge demand for click and collect. I think maybe people, they're out and about, I know not as much under lockdown too, but still a bit when, running the kids to school or whatever it may be, that click and collect can fit in nicely rather than wanting home delivery slots. So that could really shift the dial here.
And I think the point you make about Lidl being very interesting to watch in this, I think, is a point well made, partly because they seem to be going in a slightly different direction here. They are not going down that route. They are not really embracing online to the same extent, really, as Aldi have. So I think it's quite interesting that, we often think of Aldi and Lidl as a sort of, as a collective almost. We talk about the German discounters. It's always fascinating, I think, when you see them diverge on certain key strategic points. And I think this is potentially one of those areas where they're drawing slightly different conclusions around how viable that online model is within the confines of a discounter strategy. So I think it'll be very interesting to see whether we'll see them sort of pursue slightly different strategies, or whether ultimately Lidl is going to look at online capacity as well.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from CNBC, and it's an article titled "McDonald's Unveils McPlant Line," which includes meatless patty co-created by Beyond Meat. This is an announcement that's been reported quite widely. It's obviously a big move for McDonald's and the whole plant-based market. So it's quite a bit to unpick here around what it means for the category, what it does for plant-based reputation around health, and also some interesting stuff around the branding side. Just looking at social media, I think there seems to be a split between people who think McPlant is an absolutely genius name and those who think it's a terrible name. So I'd be interested to get your take on that, Bruce, in a minute. But the reason I picked this particular article is because it highlights an interesting secondary story related to this announcement, which is on the supplier side. When this story made headlines on Monday first, what you would have seen is quite a few major news outlets and wires correcting their original reporting, tweaking headlines, making a few clarifications, that sort of stuff. Because there was initially some confusion around who is going to make these patties and what relationship are they going to have with McDonald's. And what the CNBC article reports is that McDonald's, when they made their announcement, described McPlant as created by McDonald's and for McDonald's, but they didn't say anything about suppliers. And Beyond Meat then told CNBC and other news outlets that in fact they had co-created the patties that will be included in the McPlant range. Now, the significance of that statement is that Beyond Meat had a trial running with McDonald's testing plant-based products in some markets. So when that McDonald's announcement came out, talking about the new range created by McDonald's for McDonald's and not mentioning Beyond Meat, lots of people assumed it meant they had ditched Beyond Meat as a partner. And so the Beyond Meat shares plummeted. And that's when you had them coming out saying, actually, we were involved in the creation of the patties. Now, being involved in the creation of the patties or co-creating the patties sort of isn't massively precise in terms of what that means for the ongoing relationship between Beyond Meat and McDonald's. And they haven't really provided much further detail on what the relationship is going to look like from here on in. McDonald's aren't commenting on this either. So investors in Beyond Meat have really been left scratching their heads, wondering how important and how lucrative this deal really is and why McDonald's isn't willing to go on the record confirming the relationship. There are some possible explanations here, including that McDonald's basically wanted to make this announcement about what they are doing, wanted the focus to be on the significance of the deal for them rather than creating a distraction by making it all about a particular supplier, which I think makes sense. Beyond Meat has a big media profile as well. You could quite easily see that mentioning that company in the announcement could have resulted in some headlines sort of focusing on both companies rather than just McDonald's. But I think in a way, not having the supplier in there has created more headlines because there has been that sort of element of uncertainty. And you're certainly still looking at the coverage today. There's an interesting piece in Bloomberg as well. There still seems to be a fair bit of head scratching around what exactly that relationship is and what it's going to look like in future. So this deal, this range, I think is going to be watched very closely by the market, not just because of what it means for plant-based, but also to see if we can get a few more details on exactly who is going to be making these products. So a big move, big announcement, but also lots of unresolved questions still to be answered. Bruce, what did you make of it? And I'd love your take on the whole McPlant brand. What's your sense of, is it a good brand name, do you think?
I actually don't mind the brand name, I have to be honest. I think the challenge is that they've done what McDonald's always do, is they've gone for a very generic sort of feeling of, it's just going to be feels like a vegetable burger, rather than trying to be a little bit more emotive in terms of how they come across. And that's where I think the name McPlant feels a little bit, I don't know, it doesn't deliver taste to me, or sort of that, so I think it could have been a little better, if I'm honest. And I generally hope that they actually do appreciate that there's a lot of people trying to reduce the meat intake, and perhaps you'd be thinking about health as well as just doing a vegetable option, and how they can actually move forward from just having a salad or, carrot sticks to something a little bit more interesting in the way they actually bring a more healthy menu in terms of the way they cook the product, etc. That's, I think, is the challenge, that, it needs to be vegan, not just vegetarian. And also I think they need to think about the health and the nutrition and the actual taste, I think is a really important factor. Otherwise, we're just eating unhealthy vegetable products rather than unhealthy meat products, which I don't think is a big opportunity. So I think they need to think about the opportunity of actually making sure that they can actually concentrate on health as much as the fact that it's meat-free.
I was really interested by this article, and particularly as you've explained there, Julia, about there's still a little bit of ambiguity over that supply chain piece. I think doing pieces of work with McDonald's in the past, they are always very progressive about talking about their supply base, their farmers, their and leading the charge in terms of carbon emissions and trying to get the baseline of production up to make sure that we're doing the best we can across, be that sustainability, animal welfare and other things. And as you say, Bruce, even though that this isn't an animal product, it's a plant-based product, I think the transparency over what product, what exactly the ingredients are in there, what they're doing to try and shift the dial to make those ingredients as healthy, as well produced and as sustainable as possible will be key. And yeah, shareholders and the existing supply base will be watching that really closely, because you can't have it for one category and not for others, even though it's a plant, not an animal product.
Yeah, and I wouldn't look at this week's news and conclude that there is necessarily going to be that discrepancy. I think there is a very good chance that part of this was about sort of managing the messaging a little bit, and I think there is nothing to say that as they reveal more details around exactly what is going to be in that range. It's clearly not just going to be a plant-based burger, but they've also talked about potentially alternatives to chicken. And I wonder whether when we're actually going to see the final product lineup and the menu items, whether some of that more foodie language, that perhaps something that's perhaps a little less sterile than McPlant is going to appear there. But, I think this is such an early stage in this announcement that I would expect them to talk a little bit in more detail about what's happening on the supplier side in due course. But yeah, Laura, I agree. If you champion supply chain transparency and you want to put up your farmers and talk about who supplies your beef, you should show the same level of enthusiasm across your range. And of course, if you have a plant-based range that you're really proud of, you should be championing and shouting about your plant-based suppliers, because you should be equally proud of them as well.
I agree. I think it'll also be interesting to understand how they actually work out the different products within the range, because they've always had such a simple range of products that actually if you actually start to introduce quite a few plant-based products, do you actually lose some meat products? How do you actually ensure that you don't end up with a wider selection of product choice and actually possibly confusing consumers? How do you actually introduce more plant-based and reduce the meat-based products? Should it not be a combination of both rather than just adding to the range? Should they not be perhaps seeing what meat products potentially could be dropped in replacement with plant-based products?
Laura, what's your first article for us?
My first article this week's from The Guardian, and it's independent shops hit out at high street chains trading under lockdown. And as we know, in England, we're in the middle of our lockdown too. And this is a challenge by some of the independent retailers. It's a bit of a myriad in terms of what's remained open and what's not. And something that I've picked this article, something I've experienced myself, having a walk through town and thinking, oh, I'm surprised that retailer's open and that retailer's not, and vice versa. So the Guardian article talks about thousands of independent retailers have urged the government to crack down on major chains, and that the chains it name checks in the article are the Range, Carpetright and Ryman's for continuing to trade under lockdown despite largely selling non-essential goods. It doesn't reference it in the article, but something that sprung to mind and something we've chatted about on the show was Wales, and how the fact they tried to stop the sale of non-essential goods in other retailers, and that's something that we haven't seen in England. But what that's created is independent retailers feeling really frustrated that they've got big competitors selling products that they normally sell, but they've had to close their doors. So there's a nice soundbite in here from Andrew Goodacre, the chief exec of BIRA, the trade association representing 3,000 independents, and he says his members are furious that large homewares and non-food businesses were continuing to trade while small businesses were sticking to the rules, and they're using words like injustice, unfair and unlevel playing field. It talks about supermarkets, garden centres, bike shops and newsagents, and those selling food, pet supplies and hardware, including DIY shops, are all classified as essential and allowed to continue to trade. And as I say, it's this what's essential and what isn't piece. And there's a nice little soundbite about Mike Ashley in here of a Frasers Group. And he said the government's handling of the coronavirus was causing devastation to the retail sector. And it's interesting that the Frasers Group have decided not to open any of their chains, or to try and get any of their chains to open during the lockdown, which they did try with Sports Direct during the first lockdown. In their portfolio includes Evans, the cycle shop, and even though that they probably would be allowed to open, they've decided not to. And it says a source from one major major retailer that competes with the range, that it's like the Wild West out there. The legislation was rushed and now the government has lost control, and some of the big retailers are taking liberties with a very unfair playing field. So it's just really interested me, as I say, from a personal point of view, being surprised about what retailers are open and what aren't, even going into shops pre-lockdown, probably like a lot of other folks rushing around and thinking, right, I need to get this before your shop's closed for the next month, and them saying, oh, well, actually, we're going to be open next week, and being quite surprised at that. And actually, is that fair or not? And should retailers be taking more of a moral standpoint? M&S are name checked in the article, saying that they are only going to open clothing areas that are adjacent to their food halls, and not open wider sections of their stores and close off other sections of their stores. Bruce, what's your experience and what are your thoughts of this when you're looking around retail at the moment and seeing some of these small retailers that are really struggling, and the bigger boys are naturally wanting to keep trading?
Yeah, no, I think it's incredibly unfair and very confusing. I'm totally confused which stores are classed as essential and which ones are not. And I think that's part of the reason it's driven online sales, because people just, they don't want to end up going out and realizing that the shop they wanted is shut. So they end up going online. And I just think the smaller retailers, I mean, the vast majority of businesses in the UK are small independents, and they really are struggling because they physically, I mentioned earlier of a lady that was in tears in a local shop to herself because she knew that lockdown was coming and she thought she wouldn't survive. So it's really difficult, but I just think the government's handled it really poorly in terms of how it's been communicating, and some of the bigger retailers have exploited loopholes to stay open, while the general smaller retailers have just followed the guidelines to the letter, and unfortunately that's been their downfall in a way. I just think the government could have handled it an awful lot better than they have.
Bruce, what's your second article for us?
My second article is from The Grocer, and it's about Nestle buys Mindful Chef to increase its direct-to-consumer profile, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, basically, Mindful Chef are a bit like a recipe box, like a HelloFresh. So they're very positioned around health and freshness, and that comes through in the recipe. So they're very much at the premium end. The interesting thing is the founders, Giles, Miles, and Robert, are actually remaining in the business, and it's actually the private equity company Piper that are no longer going to be involved. And Mindful Chef's a really interesting company. They've actually grown massively over the last 5 years, as we've all started to think about trying to use a sort of recipe box solution to our sort of diets. I think no food waste, and it's everything's used, and it's a really clever. They've grown to now predicted to be 50 million. And interestingly, they did a lot of their seed funding and grew through. There are actually people like Andy Murray and Victoria Pendleton and Will Greenwood invested. So I think they're a very, very cool company. But I think the most interesting thing, which caught my eye, was actually one of the bidders who was unsuccessful was Waitrose. And I do think I am surprised that the retailers haven't already got a recipe box solution, because I do think that's a massive miss, and it's interesting to see that Waitrose obviously are now looking at it seriously, because I do think there's a huge opportunity to actually, using freshness ingredients, encouraging us to actually get back in the kitchen and cook. I do think the retailer that jumps on this bandwagon first, because they've got massive buying power and a massive opportunity to cross-sell in the store. So actually not only sell the recipe boxes, but give the consumer the opportunity to actually come and select items for a recipe box. I think it's another huge opportunity. And again, importantly, I think another differentiator they could create to our friends, a discounter. So I do think they really need to jump on that quickly. And it'd be interesting to see who's first off the mark.
It's a great article, Bruce, and the cross-selling point that you make there is really interesting. Nestle's ownership of Nespresso and other brands, you think how easy is that going to be for them to cross-sell into their wider portfolio? And it's something, as you say, that's always troubled me why retailers haven't jumped on this quicker. And do you think it's because of the traditional setup of a retailer is in category teams, and it's about making a margin for that team and that area, rather than, do you know what, we could work with other areas of our colleagues and teams to put a product together? And it's always been, I guess, looking at the protein category, it's always been, why aren't you doing a gondola end with all the different ingredients and some wine? And it's always felt quite challenging for retailers to do that. And we've seen the likes of Morrisons, I guess, being quite leaders in terms of some of the boxes that have run over the pandemic, and how they've sort of changed the game in terms of that. And you're right, with Waitrose being name checked, I think others will be looking at this and thinking, how do we jump on the fact that consumers just want that ease and that convenience to be able to feel like they're cooking, when actually they're probably just putting a few things in a pan and warming up. My ideal type of cooking, by the way, rather than actually cooking from scratch.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the challenge is from a planet point of view, and I think the younger, we're quite grown up children now, but in reality, I think they see the advantage of actually the recipe box where they can actually cook from scratch. There's no food waste. They're actually creating a recipe. I'm guilty of going into a retailer, buying lots of products I don't actually need, and then actually thinking when I've got them home, what am I actually going to do with that? Have I actually got an actual recipe? Often you end up with, reward on the shop where you actually come back and go, I've not actually got a proper meal here. I've just got lots of bits. So I think the opportunity, as we all become lazier, but also understand that we need to be eating healthier, I think there's a good opportunity to, if you can create something to help people make their life easy, but enable them to use fresh ingredients and not waste food. I think that's a huge bonus.
You're totally right. And I think we talk a lot on the piece, and we even touched on it last week, about people wanting meal inspiration but running off a repertoire of 4 or 5 meals. This gives you an easy solution to have 10 meals or even more in your repertoire without feeling you're having to run the gauntlet of retail, as you say, thinking, oh, I've forgotten my root ginger or whatever it might be for that specialist recipe.
I think there are definitely quite a lot of arguments in favour of these boxes. And as you say, Waitrose being referred to in this context, I don't think they have ever officially confirmed their interest, but it's sort of been widely reported that they were thought to be sniffing around this alongside Nestle. So it'll be interesting to see whether we are going to see more interest. I think there have been some experiments in that area already from retailers. I think lots of these retailers are very much alive to that opportunity. There are, of course, challenges, and one of them is around the sort of viability of that business model. I think these box models are maturing, and it is becoming, I think, easier for them to convince investors that there is a viable business model here. And the fact that this deal has just happened clearly speaks to that. But, as with anything around online grocery delivery, there are some real challenges. You can end up with something that is a super service that delivers on health and inspiration and is incredibly convenient and makes you absolutely zero money. So that is something that obviously the retailers will be very aware of. I think, Laura, you raise a really good point about the sort of challenges around cross-category work. I do also wonder whether there are some challenges around price perception. Because, of course, you'd have to charge a premium for the service and for the fact that you are delivering to consumers, even if they pick it up themselves in store, tailored ingredients in exactly the right quantities. What do you do then around price perception and the fact that, if I give you a tiny little sort of sachet of chives or whatever it might be, or a certain spice, and you can pick up far larger quantities in the same store at a different price point, I can see that there's maybe a little bit of sensitivity there of what that does to how consumers perceive your price competitiveness. But yeah, I would certainly expect us to see more activities in this area. It'll be fascinating to see what Nestle does with it as well. They've got so much experience in direct to consumer, so I think having them be part of a box operator like this, I think opens up lots of interesting opportunities for them as well.
What's your second article this week?
So my second pick this week is from Fast Company, and it's an article titled "This Vertical Farm is Growing Food, but it's for Cows." Vertical farming is a huge topic in food and agriculture, of course. There's lots of buzz around it. We've talked about it on the podcast on several occasions as well. This is a really interesting twist on the subject because it's about using vertical farming technology to grow animal feed. And the company that's being profiled in this article is a US startup called Grove Technologies. And their vision is for farmers to grow a certain proportion of the feed they need themselves on their own farms using a vertical farming system. So there's less need to import or transport feed. And of course, by farming vertically, you're using less land as well. And there's some interesting sort of figures in this article. So Grove say a single tower of their growing system takes 850 square feet on the ground, but it can grow as much wheat or barley grass as 35 to 50 acres of farmland. Now, to be clear, the company isn't suggesting that feed grown in these vertical farming systems will replace all feed. Their vision is for it to replace a significant proportion. And in the trials they have done so far with a dairy farm in Utah, the feed from the vertical farms accounted for roughly 15% of a cow's diet. The farms themselves are quite interesting as well. They're robot operated, everything is automated. And again, the idea here is that you're making it as easy as possible for the farmer. So if you're a farmer like this dairy farmer in Utah and you buy one of these vertical farming systems, it basically runs itself. You don't need to become an expert in vertical farming to use it. You don't need to spend lots of time or hire people to look after that system. It sort of does it all itself. Still, of course, return on investment on these kinds of systems is always a big question. Operating costs can be quite high as well. And the article doesn't really go into any kind of detail on how the cost of a vertically farmed feed ration compares against a traditional feed ration. It does say that, of course, the company is mindful of the sort of cost challenges, and it has designed the system to minimize cost. They have special lights, for example, that don't put out heat, so you don't need heavy-duty air conditioning to manage temperature, for example. As I said, they're currently testing this with a dairy farm in Utah. They're ultimately looking at markets like China as sort of big potential markets for this kind of system. And interestingly, they see this as a way potentially for dairy and beef farmers to boost the sustainability credentials of their products, particularly at a time when plant-based is growing. We talked about McPlant a little earlier. Consumers are becoming more interested in the environmental impact of the products they're buying, particularly meat and dairy products. So being able to point to a system like this, making that part of your production story, making it part of the story that you tell consumers, I think could potentially be an interesting avenue for farmers to explore, especially if it ends up being reasonably cost competitive as well, because that's obviously going to be the key factor here. Bruce, what did you make of it? Could you see something like this take off?
Absolutely, I can. And actually, I think the UK is a perfect market for it because obviously it just doesn't have the landmass. I can see it being a really strong. I mean, I think it's an article they were predicting a 3-year payback, whether that how factual that's going to be. But I can see, all the unpredictability that you get with growing products in the normal environment. If you suddenly we got a hot spell in the UK, and all of a sudden the hay production in that couple of weeks was massive increase in the production. So you take all that away, all of a sudden you know what you're going to be able to, how much you're going to be able to grow. It all becomes much more scientific and predictable, which I would imagine from an investment point of view takes these sorts of unknowns away. That's got to be a good thing British farmers. So I do hope it does go, because at the end of the day, whilst I think we will eat less meat, we still are always going to be big meat eaters in the UK. And if we can actually reduce the land mass and actually plant more plant-based products, I think that's got to be a great thing, especially now as we start move to being out of the EEC as well.
I was unsurprisingly, super interested by the article as well. And it reminded me, the picture in the article, it's worth taking a look at. It was like an indoor tennis court, like one of these temporary indoor tennis courts it reminded me of from the 1990s. I can see it very much supporting existing production systems, but I'm not sure about replacing. And I guess at this stage it is talking about supporting. And I guess it's marrying up that stocking density question as well, about if you want to reduce space for grazing and you're not going to need it to grow grass necessarily, but what's the welfare challenge around that, and what's important to consumers off the back of that. And it's back to that traceability and transparency point about consumers wanting to know the carbon footprint of a lot of food that they're eating. So very interesting. And interestingly as well, it's doing well in dairy at the moment, more so maybe than beef production and the China push. So definitely one to watch. Indoor tennis courts with grass in popping up everywhere.
Laura, what's your second article?
My second article this week is from The Grocer, and it's Sainsburys to permanently close in-store counters and 420 Argos stores. This is off the back of the news that Sainsburys have had their in-store counters closed since the coronavirus starting in March, but they've confirmed this week that they're not going to reopen those. And their counters for meat, fish and some of the cheese counters as well. At the end of last year, we saw Tesco decide to close some of their counters in their bigger stores, and Asda have also followed suit. And it's interesting, the Argos news too, over the next 3 years, as it continues to integrate with the retailer into its supermarkets. Some of those stores will close, and overall there could be 3,500 roles could be affected with the proposed restructuring. And I guess there's been a lot of press over this over the last couple of days, which is super interesting, and I'm keen to chat through with you. But one of the snippets within this article really caught my eye, and it's from Simon Roberts, the new CEO of Sainsburys. He took the helm from Mike Coop earlier this year, and he's talking about the fact that COVID-19 has accelerated a number of shifts in our industry. Investments over the recent years in digital and technology have laid the foundations for us to flex and adapt quickly as customers need to shop differently. Around 19% of our sales were digital this time last year, and nearly 40% of our sales are now digital. So, and that's just an overwhelming stat that actually we're not going to standalone Argos stores as much as we were. We're not going to counters as much as we were, and the way we shop is different and is digital, as we're aware. But what's really interested me is these counters have not necessarily Sainsbury's, supermarkets across the piece, taking out Morrisons from the mix for a moment, have struggled and have tried to reinvent themselves over and over. And it's interesting, even this week I see Scott Mid are starting a franchise model with some of their local butchers to try and rejuvenate the whole counters proposition. And it's so reliant on the people that are stood behind them, the knowledge that they have, and competing, if we're talking about meat, with a local butcher, for argument's sake. Julia, I know you, and hope you don't mind me picking on you, you've just done an amazing article in the Telegraph this week about all of this. What's your thoughts looking from the sort of outside in, inside in?
Yeah, it's a really challenging time for counters, and I think the point that you made, not just about counters, but I think about all sorts of shopping trends in general. As Simon Roberts says in that quote, I think we've just seen such an acceleration of certain trends, and I think it's forcing decisions about counters, but also other initiatives at various retailers. I think the point about counters is quite interesting, that you've got sort of long-term trends that, happened long before COVID, then suddenly being accelerated by COVID. And I think with counters in particular, they can be expensive to run. As you said, you need to have that investment in staff, not just great quality staff, but you also just actually need to keep them manned so that, if people do want to use counter services, there is someone there to actually serve them. We've got less footfall in stores at the moment. People want a quick and easy in and out shop. They're not necessarily in the mood for browsing. And so if you have that kind of a shopping environment and you keep those counters open, that can be quite challenging. You get a lot of waste potentially. Waste has always been a challenge for counters, but it's a particularly big challenge in the current climate. So I think it's just accelerated some of these longer term trends. As you say, I think when we talk about the demise of the counter, we're very much talking about that traditional counter, because I think there are some interesting efforts underway in various retailers to reinvent the counter, because that sort of sense of theatre and having someone serve you and provide a little bit of something different to what you're getting elsewhere in the supermarket, I think that is still as powerful as ever. The question just is, does that need to be a meat and fish counter right now? Does it need to be a deli counter? Or is it something that is a little bit more, food court related? Asda is a really interesting example here, because they are looking at replacing meat and fish counters with sort of what they call food for now offers. So maybe sushi or hot pizza. So it still gets you something that adds some theatre and also has that sort of personal interaction potentially, just in a slightly different way that's perhaps a little bit more suited to our desire for convenience foods at the moment. But yeah, it's a really fascinating one. Bruce, what is your experience? And are you someone who would have bought from supermarket counters, or are you a local butcher kind of person?
I do love a counter, I have to say. And I do think this is a decision being pushed by COVID, and a decision that I think they will regret. And I suspect the Morrisons are absolutely rubbing their hands, because if they can make their counters a real experience where they help the consumer in their choice of meat and how they prepare it, and use it as an opportunity to cross-sell and train people well, I think the counters are superb. Their big problem, I think, is this was another big differentiator they had from the discounters. And I think to lose that, I think they will regret it. And I think Morrisons will be very happy at this announcement, and I'm sure they're going to take full advantage of it. So watch this space.
Bruce, it's been lovely to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.